say when you take out the Judeo-Christian legal system, you've only got a few options left. Sharia law is certainly one. Ruled by the computer, total control by artificial intelligence, ruled by criminal gangs like you have in parts of Mexico. I've accommodated my mind to the possibilities because I've studied history and legal history and what's going to happen. But I say that this period is the time when we're going two different ways. If people commit themselves to spiritual consciousness, not only will it begin to rebalance the scales, but it will also allow us to evolve finally so that we will be able to use the tools properly. But it does require that we draw on the perennial traditions and bring them to a higher level, which means that we do have to leave some things behind.
Hello, everyone. I'm not sure precisely where this episode will lead us, but I'm pretty convinced that it will leave us pondering existence in new ways. James Tunney, welcome to Mind the Shift.
It's great to be here, Anders. Thank you very much for the invitation. I've enjoyed listening to your other interviews, so it's nice to meet a fellow seeker.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thank you for being here. Now, you are many things. You're a barrister, a lawyer, but you're also, as I know you or know about you, you're a writer, painter, speaker, and although not formally a philosopher, it feels kind of all right to call you that as well. Would you agree?
Yeah, I don't have any problem with that. The discipline of philosophy, I think, got a bit desiccated. And in its original meaning, certainly I have no problem with that.
Yeah, okay. Or maybe you could be called or labeled a anthropologist, mythologist, philosopher, or just as an explorer of human development. Maybe.
Interesting question. I'm a bit skeptical about the rise of mythology insofar as it seeks to deontologize the phenomenon, and there's a lot of people that believe that everything is mythology in the sense of also a false story. So mythology, and a lot of mythologists, it's a critique I have of Joseph Campbell. I'm not sure sometimes if he believes in these things as real phenomena, whereas there's an element of it that is ontologically out there for me. So I don't necessarily, I think when you read sometimes with Jung or with Campbell, you're left with wondering, does he actually believe there are things out there, or do they always believe that it's in the psyche or merely in the... So that's why mythology, I understand that, although mythology is critically there, but just mythology, or the idea that is mythic and has no ontological reality, is a problem that the Germans experienced, in particular in the 19th century. And it was really about whether Christianity existed or not. Now, I believe that it happened, that the story happened, whereas most people, a lot of people now believe it's mythology. Now, certainly there's elements of the story which have variation and we can't be certain about. But that distinction is critical. And strangely, paradoxically, if we say it didn't happen, if we take the Christian story, the onus to explain what actually happened and why it's so interesting to people is heavier, and which is interesting. So that's like what Jordan Peterson engages in. You see the same problem with Jordan Peterson. People say, "Well, do you actually believe in these things?" And he has given very evasive answers. He's getting more solid in his answers recently. But so that's why my issue with mythology. I'm very interested in mythology, but I think there's different gradations in it. And
I understand.
I don't want people to understand that when I'm talking about Irish mythology, that I don't think there was a real element to this. That I don't believe in fairies. Even the question in Sweden, if you take the issue of trolls and all these beings, there's a question about, for me, do these exist? Now, for a mythologist, a storyteller, a lot of people would not believe that they exist, for example. These are the questions that come into being. And I think if you mentioned Jeffrey and New Thinking Aloud in some of his recent talks and with the studies in California, there's a lot more, people are taking these phenomena a lot more serious now, so they're not just mythology. So that's a long answer to that question.
Yes, but it's fascinating. We will probably come back to that because I think it's a matter of where you delineate between the physical world and the non-physical world, as it were. Yeah. Anyway, you've written many books with titles like The Mystery of the Trapped Light, Mystical Thoughts on the Dark Age of Scientism, The Mystical Accord, Sutras to Suit Our Times, Lines for Spiritual Evolution, Empire of Scientism, The Dispiriting Conspiracy, and most recently, you've published a book called AI Posthumanism, a cryptic soap opera, which I'm sure that, or I know that I want to delve into that topic a little bit later on here. So, you said you mentioned Jeffrey Mishlove there, and we talked about him before we started recording this episode. But I learned about you mainly through your amazing thoughts and insights that you display there on psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove's fabulous YouTube channel, New Thinking Aloud. You've made dozens of episodes with him, haven't you?
I think the last time you mentioned it was 46.
46. That's fantastic. So that's a prime outlet for your thinking, I guess.
Well, for me, he's kind of what indigenous people would call an authoritative source in that sense, and because you're talking to someone who has had contact with a lot of people that are very, very important in the countercultural movement. And his friend defined the countercultural movement, Theodore Roszak. So he was there and he talked to all these big thinkers and some people that don't appear in the records. He did talk to Joseph Campbell, interview him, and other people that I'm interested in, like Malachi Martin, which, the interview is lost. But so always when I'm coming up to interesting people, he says, "Oh yeah, I met them," and so it's great to get it from the horse's mouth. And then sometimes you have to meet people to get a sense of your own sense of, it doesn't mean that it's accurate, but it's important for me to meet people in order to kind of locate them or to sense them. And sometimes you rely on other people to do that. So it's interesting to see how a person perceived another thing, because it can fit into the message. It's not determinative, but it's an interesting part of the whole picture. Yeah. So it's very, very useful contact, and very, very, because California becomes critical in a nodal point in the evolution of this story.
Interesting. Why is that? Why California?
Well, you find in the book that I'm finishing at the moment, what I'm explaining is that the future governance of the human is going to be by total control of their nervous system. That's the dystopian aspect. And in many senses, what's happening is we are having a new nervous system, and this is the way it's described in cybernetics and nerves of government, which is happening. This describes the system of control, which is growing. It's analogous to the human nervous system, but it's mechanical. And in that, you see that there's certain phases, certain times, which are critical. So I liken those to nodal points in the brain, like you have an executive control and you have a subconscious, a history. So you see it's shifting at various times. Now, London is a critical place. London, in relation to executive control, is just a critical place. And I locate that in the Norman tradition in particular from France. So, and this is the basis of my critique in relation to power structures, which I've sought to elucidate. So California became important in the mid-19th century, and it was described when they were setting up Berkeley. They said it would be an extension of empire, even after independence. But that's there, and that became a node for Japan, for example, for the Navy base. Mm-hmm. If you look at UFOs, the Navy, Silicon Valley, you can't escape from the significance of California. Sweden in the 70s and 50s was critical. So if we think about a lot of this
during the time of Emanuel Swedenborg
and Carl von Linnaeus, and they were involved in the Swedish Scientific Association, and they were related as well. But people forget that Swedenborg had a great scientific reputation, and he became interested in spiritual. They also forget that Linnaeus wrote Nemesis Divina about his conception of God, and this is critical. So Sweden was a nodal point, and of course, when the theory of evolution has been presented in London in 1858, the two theories of evolution, remember, they're presented in parallel.
Well, Wallace and Darwin, right?
Wallace and Darwin, yeah. And of course, we don't hear about Wallace. Why? Because there was a spiritual dimension to it, and that wasn't in the picture. So something was lost in translation. But they were presented at the Linnean Society in London. The society set up to honor Linnaeus. So there's a direct connection. And of course, ideas of where humans fit in relation to evolution directly come from his taxonomy and his desire to organize nature, whether he intended that outcome or not. And Swedenborg is he's the basis of the spiritualist movement around the world. So when we're looking at spiritism in Brazil through Kardec, it goes back to Swedenborg. You could argue that American transcendentalism goes back to Swedenborg. A lot of spiritualism in London with Blake goes back to Swedenborg. His profound influence. And even just another 2 points about that for people that don't know about Sweden. Even Beowulf, the first poem in the English language, epic poem, it came originally as a story with links to central Sweden. And in fact, reading it in Old English as a Swedish speaker, you would understand it better than a modern English speaker. The connections with some places. So Sweden has been underestimated in relation to its influence, and in relation to, there are things to be discovered in Sweden that have been left behind in its ultra-modernist secular movement. They have very interesting contributions to these debates. So Sweden was a node. So these nodal points shift as with elements in the brain, and you have to follow certain patterns in order to follow. Germany in the 19th century and in the 18th century, and Goethe and places like Jena, etc. There's a lot of literature about that now. Particular nodes in Germany were critical in relation to what was happening, and we see, for example, in that, just to point to one more thing, a shift in the 1830s and 1840s away from natural philosophy to the idea of the scientist. And it happened in Britain in the 1830s and in Germany in the 1840s. And that's quite a definitive point where they say, well, we're not engaged in natural philosophy and we leave certain things alone. And wrapped up in that is certain ideas like biological determinism and ideas of who we are and what life is. So this is the thing that people assume, oh yeah, I know what life is, but actually the greatest philosophers don't know what life is, and they can't describe it and they can't define it, which is very, very important in relation to, debates about what life is, the meaning of life, the meaning of what, and so that debate is all the people engaged in these debates had to come to those considerations. And as well as that, the last point, in relation to what consciousness is, my argument is that there's no hard problem of consciousness, really, that consciousness is spiritual consciousness. And what happened, particularly from Thomas Henry Huxley, the X Club in Britain in the 1860s, and in parallel thing in German society as well, but in particular in Britain, out of an imperial administrative sense, that they simply excised the spirit from the thing, and they left consciousness. That's where psychic forces came from in the 1870s. They had to come up with another word that was suitable to the scientists around them. So psychic forces was a definition used. And psychology came on stream exactly at the same time. So psychology is the leftovers from the spiritual world. And now, as we move to a post-materialist world, people realize they have to recover what was put aside. And so I would define consciousness in terms of spiritual consciousness, which opens up what was there before.
I couldn't agree more. But I mean, people like you and me can say that there is no hard problem of consciousness. But for people who are staunchly, materialist or physicalist, there is a real hard problem. Because I mean, I look at this. I look into this science quite a bit, actually, and there are new studies coming out all the time, and they are trying to find the consciousness neuron, or whatever you want to call it, or the doings, the happenings, the workings of the brain to explain consciousness. But I mean, that cannot really. It can only show you what it looks like from the outside, as it were. It
Yes.
cannot show you It cannot explain the subjective sense of being alive, or having any subjective, sense perceptions at all, I would say.
Yes. The famous work on what it feels like to be a bat, for example. So for example, I see it as very narcissistic that, again, to draw on the mythology, which I do a lot, the idea is that they've fallen in love with a reflection, which is not the real thing. And that entails nemesis coming to punish in the future, because we've externalized something, we've made an object, and we've forgotten about the subject, as you've said, and failed to see the interactive nexus between them. And it's a fascination with method, as McGilchrist talks about, the left brain focus, all that work. And there are more and more realizations of the danger of that. But essentially, the subjectivity has been left out, and in particular, the subject of the human, because you describe yourself as a humanist, I believe.
Yeah, well, an original humanist, because I know there are dozens of definitions of what a humanist is.
Yes, exactly,
I heard you talk about that, so I'm aware that this term is problematic.
Yeah. So accepting it in its positive meaning, you come back to some respect for the inherent dignity of the human. If we go back to the Renaissance, nodal, all that, the idea of dignity was fundamentally associated with that type of humanism. So it's a very noble, original pursuit, as you've said, before it becomes reduced later. But you're forced to recognize what the human is in that, and you're forced to try and understand what the human is. And in spiritual terms, where that fits in is the idea of the pontifex, the bridge between heaven and earth. And this is what's like Syed Nasser Hussein Nasser has explained about this clash between Promethean man and the idea of the pontifex, which is in all spiritual traditions, that we're in the center between the heavens and the earth and connected with both. And that transcendent connection is severed by a lot of modern articulations, which are misarticulations, as you have anticipated and suggested in your wider definition of humanism. So, and now, of course, it's becoming clearer that transhumanism comes from humanism, and posthumanism is a reaction to it. But that doesn't take away. So there may be in future, the other trend, which is kind of forgotten about, is personalism. So I think there may be some reiteration of something like human personalism to bring the original meaning and that personalism has to allow for the transcendent. It cannot, in a post-materialist world, methodologically even, it cannot exclude those aspirations to whatever people want to call the supernatural, the higher transcendent realm, the internal realm, whatever.
Yes, I agree. I have this heading in my notes here that say humanity at a crossroads. You say on your website, you claim there that the individual spirit has never been so threatened as now. So what do you mean by that? Are we living in crucial times right now? And in that case, why? Well,
and of course, I'm not criticizing you when I'm talking about the labels about humanist of yourself. It's difficult for me, and to come up with labels for myself, as we talked about in relation to mythology. If we look at Rudolf Steiner, and people like that, they anticipated that there would be an assault on the spirit with the objective to remove the human spirit, the human spiritual consciousness. I believe that, consistent with the idea of creating a total control of society through a technical nervous system, a technosphere, that its objective has always been to govern the human totally. And the ideas that people think are nice have been integrated into the system, or endosymbiosis, as I call it, which entails the system coming inside you, must be associated with the end of humanity. I draw the analogy between it and possession in spiritual terms. Or if we look at the work of Wade Davis in relation to zombies in Haiti, when he was looking for the physiological explanation, it's a similar thing. It's a prosthesis or coming into the body, and its sole purpose is to condition the human to align with the external system, whose interests are not consistent with the idea of the spirit and the spiritual expansion, especially because the people who promote the system don't believe in the spiritual consciousness or don't want it. So I believe that the origins of computers, going back to Babbage, the origin of science, the origin of this shift in evolutionary theory away from the spirit, especially through Thomas H. Huxley, is an effort in imperial governance, post-imperial governance, as anticipated by and explained by H.G. Wells. So that the future was biopower, the future envisaged in the New World Order. Now, that's not my title, that's the title that H.G. Wells gave to it in his book of that name, which is a conspiracy because he described it as the open conspiracy in his other book. It's not made up. It's facilitated by the systems, the technological systems, undersea cables. And interestingly, of course, people say, well, you have to presume there's cabals. The word for the group of wasps that were behind the transatlantic cable, they were called the cable cabal. So we're open, there's nothing strange about this. I used to teach competition law. Even the most right-wing economists accept that companies collude, that people come together. You wouldn't have the system, you wouldn't have the safeguards if that didn't happen. So the idea, what I say is that there's been a collusive governance endeavor to utilize mass technology to create the nerves of governance of the globe, which will be predicated on the coming into our body. And once that happens, you lose control. And people say, well, that can't happen. There'll still be some spirit residing there. But if I locked you in a room and gave you alcohol all day or drugs for 20 years, it's very difficult to engage in spiritual development. And if you consented to that process, your consent to that, to not having control over your free will, it's on you. If that was the case, you contribute towards, you make a Faustian pact with certain things. Now, a lot of people, which has surprised, I never believed originally when I was first interested in the 1970s about Arthur C. Clarke, when he's explaining that the future will be merger of man and machine, as he said. And I said, no, well, who would want that? And that was beyond my comprehension. I thought, of all the things, I agreed with everything else that would happen. And then this thing, you say, well, how could that possibly be? But increasingly, people tell me that they'll take the chip, they'll take the pill, they don't care. What's wrong with transhumanism?
It's open now. People are talking openly about this.
Yeah. So I say, great, good luck to you. Make your choice. That's fine. I believe that this is the condensation of the human spirit into an eternal crypt. In my view, spirit persists. If you give away your spirit, all the stories, all the legends, all the myths, all the religions tell you not to do that. The one thing you don't want to do is not give away control of your spirit, to be enslaved. And it's in indigenous theology as well. So I mean, this is what the function. Technology will do it. It's the smiling face. It's the art or the Aldous Huxley version of our willing servitude. In my book about tech bondage, I liken it to this, the idea of kind of sadomasochism as a recreation. that people will enjoy their kind of what they think is role playing. But this is not role playing. This is actually giving away the one thing that we have to retain. So yes, but we're coming to that choice, and in many ways, what I think the genius of Christianity is that I believe the passion of Jesus Christ was a prediction of the final stage of humanity. That Golgotha, the skull, everything is about the skull, the brain. I've talked about that before. It's a focus on control of the mind. Even the crown of thorns is analogous to, we see this in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. We see this theme right there about control of the brain, of the skull, of the mind, and the resurrection from there, which is equivalent to escaping Plato's cave. It's equivalent to realizing you're something more than the mere physical. But it anticipates, in my view, what's going to happen to the human race about now, about 2,000 years after. That the human will be subject to betrayal by its own members, to the Judas, if you want to call it archetype. We look at it in mythological terms. This is the person who gives up the essence of what is the most important thing in their life, the thing that they subscribe to, because of a materialist mindset. In the Bible, Jesus offers, or Jesus is criticized by Judas for accepting the spikenard on the ointment, the expensive ointment on his feet, and Judas is saying, "Well, why don't you give it to the poor?" And this is a Christopher Hitchens argument. This is how Christopher Hitchens makes Mother Teresa seem like a monster. Oh, she's not worried about their material welfare. She's worried about something else. This is the split. So the analogy in Judas is, I would see, unfortunately, in some of the elements of the posthumanist, transhumanist thing.
Yeah, so I was going to ask, who is Judas today? Is that the leaders
Judas is
purportedly doing good things for humanity, and that we should understand and be grateful and thankful for that?
Yeah, the Judas thing is the person who doesn't realize who they are and what they're dealing with. And the element is the Christ-like in all of us, that potential. And his affinity is towards the state, the authorities, the material realm, and what is going to work in the administrative context. And it's only later he realizes that the 30 pieces of silver cannot equate with what he has given up. So insofar as people say, well, why wasn't he a good guy then? He was doing something to fulfill the story. We could say that, if you want, archetypally, this element in human nature is there everywhere, including in ourselves, that we give up something we don't understand the value of. But anyway, so what I argue is that if you look at the singularity, ideas of the singularity, all the time scales, Agenda 2030, all this, it's all about 2,000 years after the death of Christ. And I don't think that's accidental. That will be the definition of the movement into the post-Christian phase. And the post-Christian phase involves a rejection of any moral principles, because we talk about, a lot of people in the spiritual exploration world, they talk about all the esoteric elements, all the internal elements. They're not comfortable when you talk about any exoteric elements. So it ends up when I'm talking to people who are very advanced, who've done a lot of things in spirituality, and I say, well, is it wrong to steal? I just ask them for argument. And they won't give an answer often. They say, well, I don't believe in dogma and all this. So when they say that, I'd say, well, what about killing and all that? I just want to know where I stand, because there's implications of these principles. So people say, well, they're just old-fashioned things, and social. They're reflections of a deeper truth, and that's a problem actually for a lot of the spiritual thing. Well, where do you come from? If you look at a perennial philosophy position, there's an argument that these principles are fundamental. They were always there. That there's certain
natural law.
Yeah, and certain natural principles that flow on that. I have to recognize the divinity in you. I must respect you. I must respect that there's something bigger than that. I must take a long-term view. And if you look at people like Martin Nowak, and who has written from a mathematical perspective about evolution and what's missing, he focuses on that tradition which says that competition is missing. The benefits of cooperating is missing. And this goes back to Kropotkin and the anarchists. And they said, well, society is really defined not by competition, but by cooperation. And which a thing that I've been thinking about a lot recently and writing about is this, why are all debates about religion fundamentally about the sacrifice? Why is that? And that's a deep question for perhaps another time. But I believe in many senses the sacrifice is indicating that there is some higher order, it's recognized in natural law, and that there is an advantage to giving things up, to releasing, to giving of yourself. Now, of course, it evolves from human sacrifice. Christian stories associate with that transition to a vicarious sacrifice. And that was particularly manifest in the Tridentine Mass and the Latin Mass. That theme was very important. And that theme, for me, has a social, cultural benefit, that it impacts on society in relation to ideas of how humans conduct themselves. And we're moving into a no-trust society, and that a zero-trust society. This is the description of. That's why technology is moving in to push out what were human interpersonal values, community that reflected deeper values of reciprocity and interaction. So how we become and express ourselves as humans, as a lot of the German Jewish thinkers expressed, William Stern, for example, the difference between a person and a thing, and he was the father of Gunther Anders, or Gunther Stern, Gunther Anders, who became a great critic of the of what was happening with technology, who married Hannah Arendt. We have a fantastic, he was a cousin of Walter Benjamin, a fantastic confluence of thinkers who are thinking about the relationship between what a person is and totalitarian systems. So once you begin to lose this idea of a human who interacts with other humans as a priority, who can cooperate, who are not determined by biology, and who are also another concept I should have put in the equation, that to take the Christian analogy, but it's in Islam as well. It's the same thing. What are we? And Jesus says, "Ye are the salt of the earth." And then he goes on to talk about the light. So there's two elements. We see a similar thing in the Quran about crystals and light. I believe that physically we're crystal, we're liquid crystalline, and that's what the salt refers to. It always has done in alchemy. And the light is what our fundamental nature is, that is in this vessel, which has
that is consciousness, basically. Light, consciousness is light, is it?
Consciousness is light, yeah, exactly, yeah. But in that, Jesus warns, if you can lose your saltiness and then you'll be trodden underfoot. So there's something important about our physical, human, personal structure, something fundamentally significant. And when we move out of that, that's what losing your saltiness. You lose your capacity to contain the spiritual essence. And you can be possessed, and you can be possessed in the material realm. So all this idea about putting your consciousness on a substrate is really about a manifestation of hell. This is one manifestation of what a hellish realm is. It would be control by the will and intelligence forces of your consciousness. So for me, it is the greatest potential manifestation, the closest description we have to a potential hell, that your consciousness could be trapped. It doesn't have to be trapped in the way they're saying it, but it can be trapped by low-level technology.
Yeah, well, let's get back to the AI thing and transhumanism in a bit. I just want to linger a little bit around the background and the history and why this has happened a little bit again, because it sounds a little bit like we're talking about cycles here. You mentioned the 2,000-year period from Jesus's time and to now, and that this is a crucial time. It sounds a little bit like cycles. Are we in what in the Hindu tradition would be called the Kali Yuga? Does astrology, as far as you understand it, tell us about such cycles, or what is going on here?
I tend not to focus so much on the cycles, but I don't deny them. And I believe that they can be important, especially when people believe they can be, and they can be very useful interpretive tools. People forget that astrology was incorporated into the Catholic Church, for example. You can still see the astrological signs around. There was no problem with that. So they accepted that it was there. And coming from an Irish perspective, For example, there's a building in Ireland that's 5,000 years old, and I had the privilege to be in a good few years ago. It's very difficult to get into it. But on the 21st day of December, the sun shines into the inner chamber, just really on that day. And this has been happening for at least 5,000 years old. So the connection with the stars is crucial. But again, that leads into it's certainly there. It's certainly there, but there can be distortion in relation to the interpretation. So sometimes I hear more. I find it less enlightening now because it's ambiguous, and the ambiguity allows people to foist certain agendas. I don't have any problem with that. And in fact, if we take the cycles, it may mean that you interpret things differently. For example, Joyce was very Catholic, and he left it, and then he comes up with his kind of worldview, which is very influential for Joseph Campbell, etc., and the mythological, the monomyth, Finnegan's Wake. Now, recently I've been thinking that perhaps he wasn't expressing that as his view. He was expressing the view of Vico's theory of cycles, which anticipated that we would move to a democratic stage, and then that would collapse, and we move back to a divine stage. And that actually, so he's merely saying that you think this is one reading. No one else has really said it. That in one way he could be saying, I see where this is going. It's going to total disintegration, and it will disintegrate. We're in the final stage. It will become beyond. It will go beyond meaning. And then we will go back to the divine stage. So he was recognizing a cyclical pattern. So I find Vico quite persuasive. I'd be more inclined in that sense. But I think it's bigger than that, because we can have circles within circles. And what I don't like about the cyclical view is the idea that it's determinative. And I believe that the best of spiritual tradition is saying that you have to evolve spiritually. And this is where we went wrong in the physical evolution. That actually what you're meant to do is evolve. And once you evolve, then you can escape the spiral that you're in. If you stay in that tunnel, that will happen and this will happen. But we're actually meant to move up to the next level. And there's a different pattern. So it's cyclical if you want it to be. Now, certainly there's clearly certain forces in the universe, certain cyclical patterns, certain effects. And some of these are going to be determinative as well. For example, just to give one example, you have the Röksten and the Rökstone, runestone in Sweden. And recent interpretations of that explain, and there's a whole range of interpretations. They say there's a story in there about, the lands being destroyed, and the wolf ate the sun. That's one of the expressions I remember. And this is by academics. It's not any people, doing it for their own agenda. This is a range of academics in Sweden, so they're serious people. And what it was referring to, they say, which I agree with, was the convulsions in the year 536, because the stone referred back 9 generations to when all this darkness happened. And I believe that this was the Dark Ages in Europe. Because in 536, we have Columba in Ireland in particular. We have the flowering of Christianity. It happened before that, but it really began to take off then. And I believe what happened, personally, was that the Druids, their power wasn't working. They're looking at the sun, worshipping the sun, predicting the sun, and then this darkness interfered. The volcanoes, probably Iceland, North America, South America. And that was the thing that changed culture around the world. They can identify through analysis of roots, and I got onto some of the scientists. There's no question, 536, 540, it was dark, things didn't grow, the sky was very dark, and it was associated with a solar cycle. So these cycles are very important. And that led to crops and that was the base of the decline of the Roman Empire, really. It wasn't got to do with internal things. These external forces are critical. And it was fundamental in the evolution of the Celtic Christian church. And I believe that was great strength. They said, okay, we have to have the sun and the cross. We have to unite them. So if you read about Columba, some scientists say it's all mythic. It's not. you could see that he became a saint. He was dealing with light beings. They're described in his nephew's book of his life. A lot of people say, well, that's not true. He was clearly operating with all the full range, with all the full powers of remote viewing, etc., etc. And in Sweden, or in the Nordic countries, the reaction was slightly different. And that was really where we get, I think, the emphasis on the sky gods, the power of the sky gods, and the dark turn that manifested in the Viking. It went a different way. But these things are crucial. So I don't believe that we're going to have global warming personally. I don't believe existential, whatever way you want to come at it. Just my personal belief. Forget about all this. I believe that we're going to have the darkness, and we're going to freeze. Rather, that global winter scenario that was around the 70s is more likely, because these things are consistent. The volcanoes, the sun things, etc. And if you look at Rembrandt, all his self-portraits, and I painted them and reproduced them. And certain things begin to become clear to you, and you begin to notice he's cold. He's cold because of the Little Ice Age. That was when,
Ice Age, yeah.
When, as you know, in the history of Sweden and Denmark, etc., it's very, very critical. So you also have these 3 days of darkness, which comes up again and again in Catholic prophecy, associated with Marian apparitions and this 3 days of darkness. For me, it's a lot more consistent with those things. So we also have the possibility, if one believed in it, that the way to end a technological civilization is to interfere in the system on which is most dependent. And insofar as this system is most dependent on the invisible space of telecommunications, activity of the sun and of this the atmosphere would be the ideal way to stop it.
Oh yes.
Turn the clock back.
Yeah.
And we have a kind of analogy going back to Atlantis. And remember that the new world order, as it's described, goes back really to Francis Bacon and the new Atlantis. They were going to do Atlantis again. They were going to recover Eden through knowledge, through scientific knowledge, and that's the philosophical basis.
Yes, I was going to ask you about Atlantis. I mean, you are talking at length here about 536 AD, which is super interesting, and I also think that has led to a lot of legends and myths and traditions. But I mean, even if I mean, history is not repeating itself, it might be mimicking itself in a way, and maybe evolution history is like a spiral. It's a spiraling thing. Which means that the similar things are happening again and again and again, but on a higher level.
Correct. I agree with that.
Way. And I don't know. Speaking about Atlantis now, if you go back that far, and we look at all these, I don't know how interested you are in lost civilizations and all these magnificent megalithic structures that you can find in Egypt, in Baalbek, in Sacsayhuaman, in Peru, and other places that are so obviously not built by the cultures that we're told they're built by, because especially in Peru, I don't know if you've been there, but it's so obvious that this is much, much, much older. And so something happened. So could it be that maybe there was some kind of an advanced civilization with some kind of technology, maybe different technology than we have today, maybe sound-based technology, what do I know, that actually collapsed because of some cataclysm, and that we are now, because we're taught in school that civilization started 6,000 years ago, but maybe that was a restart, not the first start. Maybe it was a restart. What are your thoughts on this?
There's no question about that, and I agree with the spiral. And in the spiral and the vortex, when we go up, we're approaching the same things, but we're approaching at a different level, usually with the benefit of the perspective. We can look down on the previous one. So there's no question about, so we've mentioned the 536, and we know about the Younger Dryas period and all that going back. And there's certainly, I mean, it's there in the legends. And even if we think about simple issues like about the nature of Swedish society, or where Sweden came from. If you look at one thing that fascinates me about this, because the exotic is always more interesting than the local. As they say in Irish, they used to say that the neighbor's food always tastes better.
That's why I'm talking about Peru and Egypt and places like that, not about Sweden, because I think it's boring.
But what about the megalithic sites in Sweden?
Well, they're not that impressive, I must say. Not to me, at least. It's there.
There you go. Yeah, I know. Yeah.
It's not like it's pyramids or something like that.
Okay. Except on that level. But I suggest that there will be finds in Sweden, for example, especially in that area I'm talking about. That actually we can locate. Certainly, Linnaeus went up there near the stone we're talking about, in between the two lakes, Skaraborg, all around there. And also Swedenborg lived there as well for a while. Varnhem, all that crossroads bit between the country that linked also into England. But what I would point to is that if you look at megalithic sites around Europe of a particular age, the ones that I would recognize from Ireland, they go from the Mediterranean, from Cyprus, Malta, around the coast, all the way up to southern Sweden, and I believe central Sweden. I believe that they're there and they're uncovered, or that I can see the remains in the landscape of what were the same civilization. So there's only two explanations. They traveled by boat. Well, they traveled by sea. I mean, the evidence of the distribution makes plain that these people came from the sea. Now, some people believe that there was remnants, of Atlantis, etc., that came there. But you could argue that if you had a technological collapse, the next generation would want to say small is beautiful. So it's not inconsistent with the previous one. What was our mistake? It was this hubris. It was this, that like magic focuses on our Aleister Crowley, on will. Will is, if you look at Riefenstahl and the Nazis, the film 1930, the triumph of the will. Once you do that, you're Prometheus. You're engaging in a sorcerous attempt to control the world. You're engaging in the context of the abolition of man, C.S. Lewis. You're trying to impress your will on the world instead of adhering to the world. So it's not inconsistent. For example, there are curious connections that I think are not sufficiently explored. You have the Irish heroic figure Cuchulainn, which is believed to be the hound of Cullen, but you have Cuchulainn, which is almost phonetically the same. And you say, well, they seem to be connected. When the Irish monks, they travel, it's proven now they traveled to the Faroes before the Vikings. It's quite accepted they traveled to Iceland, and a lot of people believe they went to America. Now, there's ways they could have understood that, but there's also the understanding that they knew that where they were going to, and it would have been better if Columba had gone perhaps there before Columbus. So I don't have any problem with that, but it doesn't get us away from there is a bit of a problem I have. The problem, if I look at Graham Hancock, and I find him quite of a similar vein of Dawkins in another way, that he's very zealous about his beliefs in relation to spirituality now, and that he oversimplifies present spirituality. I find him, and so there is this idea that because they were technically superior, they were spiritually superior. And in fact, the stories don't actually support this technological hubris. And the idea that because whatever, Göbekli Tepe, etc., was a particular way, and they achieved a high technological status, that they were necessarily superior to us. What if the people who are making these small monuments around Sweden or whatever, some of them which I believe are covered, what if they were actually coming more into line with the earth? Because if you look at the Aztec, the Aztec culture was an imperial culture, and you have to accept all the sacrifice, etc., and they were still purporting to deal with the gods. You could argue that there's a divine retribution element to it, that it's not in accord with nature. I'm not.
Defense, I would say that he doesn't actually claim that this earlier civilization was more advanced than ours. Actually, I mean, he talks about the Bronze Age, and a fairly advanced Bronze Age culture, but not that it was more advanced than ours.
Yeah, well, what my point about him is that the implication is there's something wonderful here. You can't get that. It's the subtext of everything he does. There's something fantastic here. Now, using that to display, say, a standard history, fair enough. In relation to our last couple of thousand years, he's very simplistic in his analysis of what has happened, and they don't go together for me. So I'm a bit careful sometimes about this glorification of a past culture that we know nothing about, and we don't accept that actually through all those tribulations that we are at a different level of the spiral spiritually now, and there is a bit of the exotic element, the appeal of the exotic as well. Where, for example, if a person wants to go on an ayahuasca experience to meet different, it's great, and I encourage, or not encourage, but I support people's choices on those things. Although I haven't done it myself, I don't feel compelled to. But so, what is the indigenous one in Sweden or Ireland? What was the way to get into mystical states? And one of the simplest ones was the equivalent of Native American sweat lodges. There was plenty of sweat lodges in Ireland, and I believe there's plenty of sweat lodges in Sweden, but they're not recognized as sweat lodges. They look like something else, food storage and all that. But actually, the sweat lodge experience is a classic way to meet higher levels, but it's a lot more ordinary. It's not as spectacular. It doesn't seem as dramatic. It doesn't seem as exotic. No. So the point I'm making about that is, yeah, I'm very interested in all those. I'm open to all those things, but they often occur within a narrative, and sometimes the narrative comes to a materialistic reading or some kind of alternative thing that has another point to it. The same thing in relation to UFOs. It enables people to have a very materialistic perspective to believe that there's something else, so that life came from somewhere out there. That's easier to understand than saying, well, actually, we have to explain where it came from. Yeah. We have to explain how you're here now. We have to explain from these contexts. We have to look seriously at what people were saying on that. So there's interesting elements. I mean, I enjoy his work. I just find him a little zealous when he's touched on, and I think contextualize, I think we have to have respect for all spiritual traditions and seek the commonality and not at the expense of another. To move to the next level of the spiral, we have to drag ourselves up, respect and be careful about how we approach or criticize. That's probably the point.
Good points there, especially concerning this externalizing the explanations of the explanations for why we're here and what we are and everything. Do you think that there was at some point in history, whatever history is, a quote unquote fall when Homo sapiens forgot who she was, and if so, when and why did that happen? Do you think also that there exists a golden thread back to a primordial single knowledge about who we are and why we're here, and what ancient traditions would you say could be said to have carried that wisdom on in that case? So was there a fall, and is there a golden thread of a primordial knowledge that we have kind of gradually forgotten?
I think the fall generally is about and this comes back to the pontifex and the idea that we're heavenly creatures, that we fall into a fine-tuned universe, that we're into a dense environment that can make us forget who we are. And it was easier for people when they had contact with nature and they had contact with the original participation that certain people talk about, that Owen Barlow and people like that it was easier for us to connect with those things. And as we develop, we become distant, and it's quite more recent. But it's inherent in all the perennial tradition that we came into this physical being. Now, if we look at the Pauli Young talking about the number 137, for example, and we look at a fine structure constant, the figure that keeps coming up again and again, we begin to see that this environment is a very, very dense, confined context. And in that context, we lose our sense of who we are. And we also have a disposition to act in a particular way in this find, so the idea of original sin is nothing more than you have tendencies to go to a particular thing. You can become Cain. You can, and in the studies of the Canaanite, kind of linked to that, you have child sacrifice. There's implications from a certain approach, all coming from his failure to not give an adequate sacrifice, which is an interesting context. So the fall is this focus on materialism now, and the ultimate fall, the irrecoverable fall. So when you're being told about the fall, it's not to say that you're a fall in a kind of Protestant way sometimes, that, you can only certain people can be saved. It's not that. It's that ultimately you can fall into the material world, the darkness, and not be able to get out because you've cut your connections to the light, who you are. If you look at one of the non-canonical Gospels, Jesus saying, if they ask you where you came from, say, I came from the place where light came into being of its own accord. Again, it's this light idea. Now, if we look at Goethe and his explanation of the rainbow, the spectrum, he was a totally different emphasis from Newton. So he said, well, Newton's experiments and explanation are dependent on you having a prism in the dark, on particular things. But light behaves in the real world in a different way. And in particular, he noticed that the rainbow, the spectrum, the colors of the rainbow appear between light and darkness. And this is a very important thing that people forget about. Or if we think of a rainbow, where does it occur? We know the sun is behind us and there's darkness behind the rainbow. It's light and dark. So the rainbow, the color, manifests between those two. Mm. And I think there was a deeper kind of extrapolation from Goethe's idea that the rainbow is this manifested world, fine-tuned universe. We're in it. We come from the light side, but we can go to the dark side, away from the light. And our job is to come home, if you like. Our job is to return to who we are. Now you have the choice to. If you make yourself attracted to the non-light, you can live there. And things associated with that are focused on the will, on intelligence, in the sense of intelligence necessary to achieve a purpose. So all the spiritual traditions say us this similar thing about pride and non-recognition of the other, and non-cooperation or destruction of things that are good, or they're kind of associated with the light. We're in this very narrow zone. What we have to do is remember who we are in order to go back. And this is very interesting because figures like David Icke, in the last couple of years, and I haven't read this book because I wrote the Trapped Light, and then he wrote a book called The Trap. I haven't read it. It's a different kind of, I suspect, Gnostic interpretation.
Same title?
No. He wrote The Trap, and his is a Gnostic, a specific Gnostic. Oh. But mine was The Mystery of the Trapped Light. I'm not saying make it any. It's just we were, I suppose, pointing to similar issues, like this idea that we're trapped. But he says that you shouldn't move towards the light in the next world. This seems to be his conclusion. It's very, very interesting. It's very, very interesting split. There are splits, and because you could listen to someone, you could find it persuasive, and on some of these issues, it really comes down to your conception of who you are. Now, you won't probably have a choice. You will move by the nature of where you are in the spiritual thing to where you're going. In a sense, light also has the connotation of lightness. We see in the Buddhist context. There's a detachment. The heaviness is associated with density. We take ourselves out of the density. Through lack of attachment, through moving away, through not being attached to our own ego, things, all that. I mean, there is a consistency. So there is a consistency between them all, in my view. They all emphasize that we are light. They all emphasize the importance of us coming to terms with the various forces. And I would include in that, in particular, the great contribution of indigenous philosophy was to understand the earth. Now, a lot of people think the earth is the determinative one now, and that it can some way exist on its own without the human element. But this is a misconstruction of what the context is. And last point, it comes then also to an issue of, well, what is the human? And in the Roman legend about care, the human is constructed out of clay by care, and that's who we are. So the earth takes back the framework. The spirit continues, but this is what we were, because the spirit was lent again by the gods, as in all the tradition. But we are defined by this care, this compassion. So what the perennial story, this is what we are, and this is the source of all our development. You cannot have a technological society unless it's a slave society, or unless there's extreme cooperation, extreme interdependence. There's two choices. So I wonder about whether this is the thing about old civilizations as well. The terms on which the civilization was made were bad terms in the end, and that really you get the high technology if you can have all the other spiritual development. If you're not able to have an equal development with the technology, your society will collapse. And I think that's what perhaps the message of some of the ancient civilizations may be. But constantly be reminded, you have to get this thing right. You have to get the interpersonal, simple things. Doesn't sound special, caring for other, and that can't be systematized, because the greater distance you have between care and its exercise, the less compassion you have, as the Tao tells us.
Which leads us back to the future, I suppose. Maybe those sages, those ancient wisdom, tales of wisdom, were pointing at our time. Because let's now talk about the time that we're in, and AI and posthumanism, as your latest book is about. Are the rulers of the societal matrix today now making a decisive attempt to once and for all take control of the populace, would you say?
Yes.
Okay, short answer.
100%. So and not just control where they can persuade you to do something, but actual physiological control of your body, so that you become an automaton. Let
me just ask another question before you dive into that. Is this attempt by the powers that be, if you might call them that, happening because they sense that their power might otherwise slip through their fingers, or is it simply because they now can?
If we go back to Winston Churchill, who's a figure that can't be dismissed, and I've been fascinated with him because he's a very, very important figure. But he negotiated with the Irish Republicans in 1921, and when they were having, a successful in its own way campaign of anti-colonial struggle. And about that time, there was a lot of consideration of what had happened in the First World War, where we were going. There was a lot of consideration of the future of technology. Birkenhead was one of the people that negotiated with the Irish as well, and he wrote about what the future would be like in 2030. They were very keyed in, and 100 years ago, Winston Churchill wrote an essay, "Shall We All Commit Suicide?" He said, well, what happens if we have a bomb the size of an orange that can destroy the world? They understood that the technology they had unleashed meant that everyone could be destroyed. So there was a combination of this terrible desire to control and a terrible fear about the loss of control, realizing what the technological forces had done. But its purest form is articulated by J.D. Bernal, the great crystallographer that anticipated DNA, and who is called the father of the science of science. Very, very big influence in China, born in Tipperary. So he wrote his book in that era in the British imperial context, but from a scientific perspective. And he tells us scientific corporations will take over the world by stealth, and then they will operate the transformation, changing human to silicon form. And the people that don't want to to be involved in that, they will live in a human zoo and be experimented upon. It's quite clear. It's laid out 100 years ago. They've told us. And this is all part of the H.G. Wells set. This is what C.S. Lewis was reacting against. They weren't reacting against a hypothetical fear. They knew what the scientocracy was going to be. This is what Tolkien is reacting against. He's trying to present a legend which for him is ultimately Catholic in a new conception, to say, okay, we have to look at this again. But they're dealing with a deliberate, consistent campaign to control the species, absolutely. So there is no free will left. That's what Huxley is saying. Look, this is where this is going. His brother Julian Huxley, is trying to build through a transhumanist who defines transhumanism, and then we have his other relations working on the nervous system, which is critical in this, controlling the nervous system, and Leonard Huxley is talking about eugenics and why we have to destroy people. And if you look as well, a word that we hear a lot is human flourishing, and now, I don't refer to you in this context, but a lot of humanists talk about human flourishing. Say, well, that's a good thing. That's nice, the human flourishing. But in deep ecology, human flourishing means the reduction of human population. It means it's exact opposite. Oh yeah, I'm in favor of human flourishing. Well, human flourishing, one of the 8 principles, means the reduction of population, or it articulates as consistent with the reduction of human population. Well, okay, we destroy them to make them flourish. I don't really understand. So it's a false friend in that sense.
I think the World Economic Forum has written papers about exactly that. I mean, openly.
Yeah. But you can't be lured in. You say, oh yeah, I'm in favor of human flourishing. Well, so there's a lot of inversion in this but there's no question. I've tried to explain that the history, going back to the Roman Empire, going back to ancient Babylon, the history of colonial control is through plantation, which involves the cultivation of crops or the acquisition of productive food, grain, for example, places, and the plantation of people as well. There's 2 elements. And that can be a very effective tool to alter power in society, to make them less homogeneous, because an homogeneous population can give you problems as a colonial power. They allow guerrilla warfare. You can have guerrilla warfare in Ireland if you have a homogeneous population. You can't have if it's heterogeneous. You will not have a widespread guerrilla war save from a particular group in Ireland in the future. It's not going to happen. That's the nature of the transformation, and I think that they're related. So the plantation, which is in the history of all the Normans, this power of plantation of crops, cotton ruled the world for hundreds of years, has changed to implantation. This is the shift, and the implantation is the cultivation of your consciousness, the extraction of value from you. So, and even electricity. The electricity is going to be taken from you to run your devices, and you will be the currency. So that's what the patents say. They're going to use you. So we have the mobile phone, we have the external technology, we have the mobile phone. Then the mobile phone will be taken away. You will have to get something inside your body. This will be, and Yuval Noah Harari says that the COVID crisis was the basis of the shift to this digital society, biometric total surveillance. So he suggests
some say it was a test run.
Well, he seems to be implying that it has happened. I'm not saying that it did, but
maybe a test run of how possible it would be to control. Basically the entire global population.
Well, there's no question. It is a test run on that. There's no question. And I mean, 3.5 years ago, I said the next one will be, and that's the question. And Jeffrey will be monkeypox. I said that on the live stream. I say, for example, it's funny how these things work. There's no question that it's a run for something else. But if you look at the patents, a lot of patents about nanotechnology inserted in the body. There's buckets of them. It's not rocket science. DARPA have been working on smart dust, neural dust, things that can control your neurons, things that can control you for for the delivery of drugs, can control your perception, or now enable you to be monitored externally by various waves. All that is there. They have that technology. There's buckets of it. That's what the next book is about in relation to how it's going to be done. So what we have then is the loss of control of our internal system, which was never available to them before. As Churchill said in 1943, the next empire is the empire of the mind. And what he meant was that all the skill that they had, and they were brilliant administrators. If you look especially at the corporate one, East India Company, etc., a few hundred people could control, the subcontinent. As well as that, of course, they're using opium and the opium wars against China, as well as getting involved in today what we see criminality. So he said the next empire would be the empire of the mind. Huxley is warning us what the upper class are going to do. They British influence on the United States was profound in relation to the origins of CIA, in relation to the American replication of the British intelligence understanding of how to control the nervous system, which came about because they had so many wounded soldiers coming back. They had so many people to experiment on, and they did. There was something like 200,000 men came back from the front, and they couldn't function because they, what we'd call now post-traumatic stress syndrome. All that kind of
the name of that project that the CIA pursued there in the 60s and 70s? It was a one-letter acronym. I can't remember it, but anyway, you mentioned DARPA, but there was some. Anyway,
the MK Ultra and all those ones.
Maybe that's the one. Yeah. MK Ultra. That's the one.
There's a list of. I have a list of them in one of my books, The Plantation of Automatons. There was a lot of them, and mind control. But a lot of that came from the British. In fact, the British, when they had the Americans coming over, they always thought they were quite naive because they hadn't got the experience that they had. And remember, at the same time, this is where we get artificial intelligence really coming from, and Turing and people like this. What they're doing is taking their experience of how rules operate, which was the genius of the British imperial system, the Norman system. They're experts in rules, and say, how can we take rules and apply it to machines mathematically to do the work for us, to extend our power? Because, again, if you look at all the sports, from golf, tennis, all those, they came about because of their genius of constructing rules to make things work. And this is what you need in an empire when you have a small group of people. So,
but don't you foresee that? I mean, artificial intelligence is a technology, of course, and we have had many types of technology invented over centuries. Don't you foresee that humankind might eventually use AI as a tool, like with every other technology that we have used, in tandem with the evolution of our own innate capabilities? Or do you think that it's out of the question completely?
No, I don't think it's out of the question. But it's that point about the parallelism that is dependent on a proper understanding of our spirituality. And most AI advocates are hostile. They're quite hostile to traditional, again, dogma, all that stuff. And a number of them openly proclaim that this is going to be God. Now, this indicates for me, they say we are creating God. I mean, this is what some of the leading people on artificial and general intelligence, etc., are saying. They're open about it, a number of statements. So that tells me that the other thing is only a dream, and it's not going to happen. Not going to happen in that way. So this will probably destroy itself before the next generation, sometime in the future, maybe where it could work. It's not going to work on the current trajectory. It cannot work when you have a materialist, physicalist view of the world, which has decided that it is going to create God and it is going to create the new human. And this is the problem. So there's a governance issue. People say, well, and the Pope has said it recently, and I disagree with him. And I disagree with most of the spiritual leaders on this. They failed on this. But he said in a statement about artificial intelligence, some of the good things, but that it's a tool. It's not a tool. It's not merely a tool. It's a tool, and the connotations of a tool, really goes back to things like hammers and that, and things we can use, or but this is a total system which was designed for a specific purpose. It doesn't come neutral to us. It comes from the military-industrial complex. It comes from their experience in war. At the moment, there's something like 10,000, as we speak, 10,000 drones flying over Ukraine. We will have them in the future. Every war has been used as a testing ground for technology to be applied in surveillance, and that's what part of this is. So the dystopia is coming. We can't get away, and we've contributed towards it. Some of us seem to want this. Some of us seem to think it's nice. Some of us seem to think it's nice. That's like in the science fiction films told us that it was going to be the dystopia. Everyone living in tents and all these machines looking into, and they think that's futuristic. I don't see it as a good thing. Yes, of course, we could do that. But where the thing is a servant of us and not the master of our spiritual consciousness, the thing that they're creating is a sorcerous, magical instrument to control consciousness, consistent with the most dark sorcery we've talked about. And even the people that are Benjo and other people are saying, well, we didn't realize that it's going to be like this. You cannot take that seriously. You cannot take it. A number of the fathers of AI have said, we didn't understand it was going to be so dangerous, so give us more power to control it. It's a cod, basically, in relation to that. Do I believe that artificial intelligence is possible and can have great uses? Of course it can do, but this is the crumbs from the table of total governance of human consciousness, and whatever crumbs, whatever people prosper, and good luck to people that do get the benefits from it. We're not going to prosper as a race. And always, and even Elon Musk has, you can read the biographies, when they're trying to sell this Neuralink stuff, they say, well, we have to kind of sell it better. We have to, encourage or talk about all the people that are going to be cured from it and all this. And they use people that have the medical needs, whatever, as as if this is the motivation. It's not the motivation. And I'm delighted if it is the motivation and people benefit from it. But it's not the primary motivation. The primary motivation is control. And if the people were not so war-mongering, if the institution that made this technology were interested in spiritual enlightenment, were interested in human development, they simply wouldn't be involved in inculcating, spreading the amount of war, the amount of weapons to destroy humans that they are doing. And there's a lot of academic work about how nearly all education technology has come from the military-industrial complex. It's quite incredible. And even, I believe, a lot of the entertainment counterculture. So if it could be, of course, but it's not going to be. I'm 100% certain about that. So I'm never going, whatever great thing that is going to be sold to me, we're willing to give away our greatest gifts for baubles, for trinkets. This is the history of man. We're doing that now, for convenience, shiny things, and instead of dealing with the great gifts of humanity that we have.
Well, I have a reflection that people like you, others are saying this, basically the same thing as you are saying now. When they say we, they don't mean themselves, and they don't mean the person they're talking to, and they don't mean their close friends and their family. They mean somebody else. But anyway, I get your point, and I think that you unfortunately might be right here. But anyway, we've spoken about the problems surrounding the term humanist or humanism. I also use to describe myself, yes, the term globalist. But I realize that it's also surrounded by a lot of problems and connotations that I don't subscribe to. So I've added that I'm a grassroots globalist. But anyway, what do you think in this context here with AI and with this new technology and the powers that be, they're trying to impose their agendas in different sectors here? What do you think will happen with nation states, politics, and money? Big question, but I think you have some ideas about this.
My family were fighting against colonial rule for hundreds of years, and were displaced, jail, prison, all that kind of stuff going back, and later entered Parliament. My uncle was in Parliament 8 times. My grandfather 6, whatever. So they went into the constitutional context after independence, involved in the formulation of the Constitution, and later my uncle was involved in peace in Northern Ireland. So they, they had moved on. But the Ireland that they would have fought for is impossible now. It's never going to exist. Irish culture can never exist in the same way as that's a statement of fact. So I'm not saying saying that pragmatically. The nation state has necessarily been toppled over because it's one of the agendas of the New World Order: abolish religion, family, and nation state. So, as a statement of realpolitik, the nations that existed are never going to exist in the same way. They have tactically, strategically sought to do, and that's successful. And I've taught in international relations as well, and I've taught in law for a long time. So I don't say that as some kind of reactionary, as a purely descriptive thing. So I know that a lot of people, for example, in the countries don't realize that they can never have it the same way again. As a statement of fact, it would never be, it will be something different. I'm not saying that's bad or whatever. I'm just saying it cannot be the same thing. So the idea, what my relations would have been fighting for in the past, a lot of it cannot transpire in that way. And associate with that, the cultural context cannot persist in the same way, including a major loss of things. For example, William Butler Yeats understood what happened in Ireland and why William Butler Yeats became so interested in magic and things like that. Was they began to translate some of the stories from the Irish language, because people spoke Irish, the mass of people spoke Irish. And they realized that in this culture was a connection that went back as, the same as ancient Greek. It had a massive amount of stories, history, etc., that hadn't been available to the English language because they couldn't speak it. So they began to realize that this, because it had been a colonial nation in Europe, a colony, that it hadn't developed industrial and therefore had retained a pre-industrial phase that wasn't available in the rest of Europe. It was remarkably different. So when I used to go around and talk to the old people, and I think I did a bit more than other people did, but I was getting access in my mind to a culture that was continuous and a heritage that was continuous going back. Now, a lot of people didn't see any value in that. So given the choice, they'd still say, oh, well, chuck it out the window anyway. But really, there was a deep, deep heritage that's been lost. Now, that's a statement of fact. So there's an awful lot. And in that, embedded in that, like Father Sean O'Leary that I communicate with sometimes in America, who's very interested in some of these topics. He used to be in the Catholic Church. He's now in spiritual development. He's very interested in therapist, a Jungian therapist. He says that if Christianity had never come to Ireland, you could reconstruct a lot of the same principles from the sayings that are in the Irish language, which are beautiful. And he'd linked them to Kenya, where he'd worked in. So there was an awful lot of wisdom that comes from that. So that goes out the window. And this is part of the deliberate process of dislocation. It's on a mass scale in this neurological context to dislocate the global population isn't important. Because if you're located in a context, it's harder to make you change certain of your views. Whereas if you're disorientated, it will be easier to do so. So I predicted some of these things in the 90s, and I knew they were going to happen. I taught European law. I mean, I gave it up, but so I knew I was exploring what this meant. From the 60s, the European Court of Justice was clear that once you join the EU, you give up your sovereignty. You pool your sovereignty. A lot of people didn't understand that, and they still don't understand that. They legally agreed to nations to do so. And I'm a pragmatist, so I say, well, what are the consequences of this? I also was involved in the World Tourism Organization and other things in the legal context of travel and tourism law and UNESCO. And there's implications from these treaties. When you say that, well, actually, the New Grange in Ireland, that old building that you went into, the sun shines for 5 days, that's not yours anymore. That's universal heritage. There's a profound impact on that. So people haven't understood the consequence. The term that I used to describe myself earlier on, or the methodology, was a pragmatic cosmopolitan, or pragmatic cosmopolitanism. So pragmatic, I focus on, well, what's the consequence of this? Without getting involved in whether I like it or not, what's this thing going to do? And cosmopolitan meaning I'm a citizen of the world, and that you have to see that.
I often claim that one of the reasons why these are crucial times is that we are integrating globally for the first time, at least in recorded history, and that does things with us. I mean, it has implications, and it's you seem to make the case here that this has been an agenda that has been driven top down all along.
Absolutely.
I can sense personally that I've never felt particularly, Swedish, or I've always thought that the nation state was a construct from the 19th century that has run its course, and it's been good for us. But I mean, that we have to move on, and because I travel a lot, and I can feel connections with all kinds of places that I visit. I love being in Spain, for instance. I was in England this year, and I felt the connection with I was in Stonehenge, and
I saw that. Yeah, that was nice. Yeah, I see that. Yeah.
I mean, why can't I be a grassroots? I mean, why can't I feel that I'm part of humanity, as opposed to just part of this geographical chunk of the planet that we call, for instance, in this case, Sweden. And by the way, many so-called nation states are not natural because they are obvious constructs like Belgium. What's the nation state of Belgium? What is that? I mean,
well, okay. Just on this point, do you think Ireland wasn't a natural state, even though it wasn't?
Yes. Well, yes, I think so. I think Ireland has a kind of a defined.
Yeah, I mean, it was very defined.
The old Celtic culture, for instance.
Yeah. It was very defined, and I mean, you see, I'm not simplifying it. I'm just saying, so it was easier to see yourself in those terms, although they were global. The problem for me is not in relation. I've no problem with the thing changing. In fact, I see those things before other people. I was teaching those things. I understand all this thing. There is dangerous and arguments about rootless cosmopolitanism that we say, well, okay, Anders, tell us something about the great monuments in Sweden, and you say, well, they're not that important. You know what I mean? But I'm an immigrant here. I appreciate a lot of aspects of Swedish culture. I learned, and I'm very interested in the traditional thing as well. So they can be separate. So I've no problem on that. The problem I have is, and there's books written about this, about forced migration as a strategic policy, is that the mass migration across Europe usually resulted from the policies of the military-industrial complex. Bombing Syria, bombing Iraq, bombing Libya, bombing Bosnia, Serbia. That caused the flows of population. Now, if, as my argument is, that the same body is controlling the movement of people for strategic interests associated with the vision which has been laid out clearly in the New World Order by H.G. Wells, who posits a world which is disintegrating from which this order will come. What I say is that the consequence of this type of forced movement of people, predicated on intervening without justification in illegal wars, will be devastating for the people of the area and ultimately for the people who come in that form, because it's premature. It's not merely a function of technology. It's not merely a function of the visitor going to another culture, or the visitor being welcomed. It's being forced, and that element is the deliberate policy. That's the problem. So absolutely, I'm in favor of the normal evolution through mutual interdependence. I detest any form of racism. I detest any extrapolations from race. I detest the condemnation of any race or the treating people different on the basis of the pigmentation of their skin, etc. But we've seen what's happened in Ireland. What the plantation process was to take a group of people who were different into Ireland, and people think that Ireland was a Catholic Protestant thing. That was a later thing. When the first Normans came, they were Catholic, invading a Catholic country that had supposedly saved Europe and saved civilization in Europe, a great source of Christianity. This was a different element within the ruling structures. So there's a lot of complications.
Then half the Irish, they of course emigrated to the United States.
They did,
and
although
put their print on that culture.
Yeah. Although that's used to say to the local people, therefore you have to take people, and that's a different issue. So yeah. I'm a pragmatist. These things are happening, but I'm concerned about the prematureness of the things, and there is no question that there are irreconcilable differences that they're not going to be solved because there are
foreseeable future.
We're creating differences at a stage where we haven't allowed an accommodation or a system to accommodate those differences. And unfortunately, and you've talked about pathology and psychopathology and governance, and now I don't like the recent stuff on that. I like the original stuff going back to Lobachowski, which came from Krakow, and he saw the Germans and the Nazis and the Soviets, and they began to understand how this worked. We have to be careful that psychopaths are very good at setting people against each other. They know how to manipulate people. So if we have a psychopath there, he could probably set us against each other. Well, that could be an objective, and then they can sit back and be the independent, benevolent figure on the side. So it's a real danger. So I'm cosmopolitan too, and my pragmatic arguments from the 90s onwards were arguing that you have to be very, very careful about how you facilitate the movement of everything I did. Every subject I taught was based on the fact that we were going to live in this environment. But in relation to the political management of these things, I believe there are nefarious purposes that are complicating some of these things. And I mean, Iraq is a great example, and that was one of the factors that led me away from academia, because I said, okay, all the principles that I've been learning about international law are just thrown out the window. They're just disregarded. It's not real. This thing about when you can launch an illegal, that's what the Nazis were prosecuted for, a war of aggression, an illegal war. So these guys can do it. And there's no consequences, and they can do it with a plan. In fact, H.G. Wells, in his books about the what will happen when they form the New World Order, he has the center of the air command which control in Basra, which is quite incredible. That's just an accident. When Bush's father was talking about the New World Order, so no problem. But we're being forced to take something without something else. That the guest-host relationship is fundamental, but it cannot be. It doesn't work when the guest is ignored or the host is ignored in relation to the relationship. There has to be equal, and in fact, the nature of a host-guest relationship. Otherwise, it becomes into a hostage, which is a similar etymological context as well. So I'm pragmatic and cosmopolitan. You have to look at the international forces. But there's a lot of complications, a lot of things that can't be understood. Why do the countries not insist that China goes through this process as well? Why is China not? I've worked in China. Why is China not forced to be more diverse? And they're not going to do it. They have no intention of changing. Why are they doing badly out of this non-diverse strategy? It's so I don't. It's not about goodwill. It's not about openness. I'm a migrant myself. I understand about migrants. I never criticize migrants. I'm criticizing the military-industrial complex that's forcing people to move, and I'm criticizing the objectives of why they're doing so. Remember, Gaddafi said clearly, they're not going to get rid of me. They need Libya here, because if I was gone, all of Central Africa would come up into Europe.
And he was right, yeah. But why they are moving in the first place is to discuss. I mean, that's.
And then also, guys, the question is, why not? And you have experience of Africa, of course. Why not? Why does not development concentrate in the countries with great resources? The people that should benefit from those resources are being forced out and the resources are not going to the local community.
That's true. That's true. But the reason why people are moving away a lot more now from countries like Nigeria and Ghana and Senegal is not that they are dirt poor, because it's because they're a little less poor than they used to be. They have money, they have mobile phones, they know they have aspirations in life. So that's also, I mean, politicians in Europe. I've been writing quite a bit about migration and studying it a little bit, and they are saying they're just lying about the reasons behind migration. Or they don't know the driving forces, or they're lying about it. So it's I'm critical towards that. So I mean, generally, migration. I agree with you that there's a lot of nefarious stuff going on around migration and the reasons behind it and all that. But to ask you a final perhaps question, we'll see. You mentioned that, as you say, we're not going to step down into the same river twice. Nothing's going to be exactly as it has been. So we have to accept that the world is going to change in some way. And maybe if we don't have nation states, maybe we can. I mean, if we think positively about it, maybe we can rule this world from a more not top down, but the other way down, up, decentralized way. And you did mention that this is a period of distrust in leaders. And I also have the impressions that people today, they think for themselves much more than they used to. I mean, like, go back to the 50s and the 60s, people voted the same way their parents voted. And they trusted the authorities, they trusted the leaders, they thought the leaders were wise, and they were happy to, hand over power to people with titles and things like that. But people aren't really doing that now, at least not in the West. I mean, I know quite a few people who are very skeptical and very critical towards, the policies around the COVID pandemic, for instance, and also what's happening in Ukraine and all sorts of stuff. And so isn't that, in a way, maybe grounds for hope that it is like that, if you agree with me that this is the case?
Just one last point on the migration. In my pragmatic cosmopolitan world, I would have kept the nation state and said, okay, we're in the technology has made it global. You compete for your migrants. You say, I'm Ireland, I'm green, I'm quiet, come here, whoever, this is the conditions and this is the deal. And Sweden would say, well, we're this, we're up and we're good at this and we're good at, and other countries, and that would go back to an earlier Ricardian notion, perhaps, of economics. I think that was the move that would have made a lot more sense. Oh yeah, and facilitate migration and say this is the deal we're doing. You're coming here for this is what the ethos that we want to create. Instead of, because what happens in the diversity thing is standardization, and this standardization is the thing which homogenizes ultimately. Although it purports to be different, it's not really different. So. In relation to the future, there are people questioning in relation to the amounts. If you make a video on, I don't know, baking a cake, you'll get more people sometimes than spirituality. They're not really interested. A lot of people can't, it's a small group of people who range of people, and in fact, they're the people I feel an affinity with, which is beyond nation, beyond whatever. These are. So these are the new families that are creating on a different context. And the problem is that the systems are not decentralized. They have an element which appears decentralized, but they're being set up to be centralized. There's a relentless economic, technological force that Lull talked about, which makes everything standard. That's what it does. And he predicted that the nature of industrial production drives out the organic. You can't have anything organic in the system, and unfortunately, we're organic. But that was predicted by Bernal. We would become silicon to fit into the machine. So the people that, or the systems, the power structures that have been set up, and often they're not the ones you think. For example, in studies of academic studies of the power structure, groups like the Business Council in the United States were more powerful than other. If you look at the connections. Things that people are not actually talking about. Some of the other ones are red herrings. Nobody really talks about the World Trade Organization, which was really critical in all of this. And again, was led by an Irishman, Peter Sutherland, whom my uncle beat in an election before. Anyway, so what I argue is that the promise of spiritual evolution is that we will be able to either balance or solve these problems. That's the reason, the incentive to do so. That the failure to include genuine spiritual consciousness with frameworks that allow for interdependence and elevation from whatever position people come from are both the solution to the problem and the hope. Absent that, it's a disaster, an absolute disaster, that God will punish us for that. Nature, the system will intervene. It won't be allowed to go on. Whether you want to say extraterrestrials will intervene or whatever, it will not be allowed to continue beyond a certain point. And we may be praying for that to happen. And in fact, in some of the prophecies, they say that you will be praying to not be alive, not be left. So that's a dark thing. The hope is this cultivation of spiritual consciousness, the recognition of spiritual consciousness, including the exoteric. We have to the external bit. You cannot ignore moral principles and the implications of them, because these are the things. When it comes down to, from a legal perspective, when it comes down to, there's only a few options you have. Say when you take out the Judeo-Christian legal system, which has been in Europe for hundreds of years. You take that out, for example, you've only got a few options left. Sharia law is certainly one. Ruled by the computer, total control by artificial intelligence, ruled by criminal gangs like you have in parts of Mexico. There's only a few options left. There's not all an inevitable benign situation that happens. All these things are going to flow on from the decision we've made. I've accommodated my mind to the possibilities because I've studied history and legal history and what's going to happen. So I'm not going to be shocked by what's going to happen. But I say that this period is the time when we're going two different ways. That really, if people commit themselves to spiritual consciousness, not only will it begin to rebalance the scales, but it will also allow us to evolve finally so that we will be able to use the tools properly. But it does require that we draw on the perennial traditions and bring them to a higher level. There is coming out of the chrysalis thing, which means that we do have to leave some things behind, and we do have to think in a new way, cognizance of what has happened. And we do have to persuade people that are in these complexes that it's not the way forward, to advocate for spiritual consciousness, to really show them the power of it. We have to demonstrate that as well. And that's the difficulty. That's the challenge. We have to begin to show people that these things are ontologically real. They're not just stories. They're not just part of some other complex. They are the defining issue. They are who we are. And if we do so, that's the hope. So my delight comes from this darkness, from this contrast. You can choose to go along and say, "Oh, I don't have to think about this," and I'll go along with the flow. But it doesn't come to a nice place.
So people like me, we have to actively be good examples. That's what you're saying.
We have to be, and we have to live the spiritual. We have to live the spiritual thing and expand it and learn from the tradition. It's not easy. It's not simple, and we also have to redefine the things for our own times. To take, if you're a Christian, to take it into an applicable context, in an applicable context, or a Muslim to bring the game up where we can operate at a higher level with mutuality and respect. But there is a war on the spirit, a war on religion, because the people behind all these systems have told us they're going to abolish it. And the easiest way to do so is to create interreligious strife. Unfortunately, that's the way that is suggested from the people who are anti-religion. The optimum psychopathic way is to set religious groups against each other. That's the problem. So we also therefore have to be conscious of what possible dangers exist in this geopolitical game. And if we do so, and then people in those communities, the intellectuals, the spiritually aware, can begin to say, okay, I'm beginning to see this, the possibility of genuine cooperation on a much higher level, which is informed by the spiritual inputs by the thing. So that's my hope.
James Tunney, it's been a fantastic conversation and fantastic to listen to your thoughts and insights. Now, where can people go if they want to find out more about you? And
just on I have a website, jamestunney.com, and see all the links to interviews. I'll put a link to this interview here as well.
Yes, I'll put it in the description box, of course.
Yeah, and that's it basically. I don't do other social media, so that's a good portal if you like.
Well, I really appreciated this, and thank you for being a guest on Mind the Shift, and good luck now with your continued exploration of the human predicament.
Yeah, and thank you for your exploration. I like your openness and your willingness to consider the issues, and of course, I know you. It's clear from what you say and what your interest that we can't have narrow labels on things, and I think we can reinforce across boundaries, across former compartments. That's what's necessary in the new thing. But and it's by taking spirituality seriously that we'll find the keys to solve these problems, and also to counteract any negative things. So I'm not negative in my outlook. I'm pragmatic, hopefully, but so the hope is there. So good luck to you and your work, and I'm sure we'll talk again sometime.
Yes, I'm sure as well. Thank you.
Right, thank you.
If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe, and don't forget to hit that like button and share the video with your friends. Please support the channel if you can. I appreciate all the support. You can become a Patreon for as little as $1 a month, or you can make a one-off donation via PayPal if you wish. All the links are in the description box below. Thank you.